Tēnā tātou katoa, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā iwi o te motu, ki te tangata kua hui nei ngā mihi. Good morning, everyone. I've just greeted you in the Māori language, which is Indigenous to New Zealand, which is where I am. And I said, good morning. And I acknowledged the authority and the language and the people of these islands that we live on. Ko Tracy Bridges aho, no Manawatu aho. I'm Tracy Bridges. I come from the mighty Manawatu in the North Island of New Zealand, and I live in Wellington. I've spent 20 years working alongside New Zealand public sector on communication and marketing programs, often on behaviour change programs such as road safety, alcohol moderation, sexual health, biosecurity, accident prevention, violence prevention, water safety, all sorts. My short presentation today offers a provocation, and it's based on 3 observations that have risen from my experience over the years. The first observation is that people involved in government communications are doing it fundamentally because they want to do more good in the world. But second, that the system of government often makes it really difficult to achieve that good. And third, that we're all more powerful than we think. And we each hold the ability as leaders in our worlds to contribute to a power shift if we set our minds to do so. So to my provocation, and it is this. In a world where inequalities are increasing and deepening day by day, is it possible that our government communications are increasing rather than reducing those inequalities? And if so, what can we do about it? Let's step back for a moment and think about the nature of inequality. Government communications, especially those with behaviour change goals, often set out to try to address individual aspects of harm. Eat healthier, smoke less, stay at school, all those programs that I talked you through a moment ago that I've been involved with in my time. But there are several problems with this approach, and fundamentally, the key problem is that troubles don't travel alone. The burden of harm often falls on individuals and communities that are suffering multiple stresses. If we just take one lens for looking at this for a moment, which is an ethnicity lens, and this chart summarises some of the sorts of factors that might be affecting populations in New Zealand, and it looks at Māori populations, our Indigenous people, and Pākehā populations, so non-Māori or European New Zealanders. Although the statistics here are New Zealand ones, you could make a similar table for any country or any community using different populations, and you will always find that there are some groups that absolutely carry the burden of harm. In New Zealand, for Māori are significantly overrepresented in these harm statistics. They are far more likely to be victims of crime, far less likely to participate in higher education, far more likely to be incarcerated. They have lower life expectancy, higher instances of disease, lower incomes, lower education levels. Some of these statistics are set out on this chart. And look, I hesitate to even paint this picture because, of course, it's not a full picture. It ignores the extraordinary achievement of Māori in every walk of life, and even presenting it can in itself contribute to negative stereotyping, which is an additional kind of harm. But the statistics remain. And although they have to be treated with care and interpreted carefully, we can't ignore the real-life implications for the individual people that the statistics represent. And these are the people that we are targeting with our campaigns. And the crucial point is that when you start to see patterns of harm like this, you have to understand that inequality doesn't come about because of individual failure or weakness. It doesn't come about solely because of the choices that each person represented in this chart is making. It's the cumulative effect in this instance of colonisation, of layer upon layer of systemic racism compounded over generations. And what this means for us is that any program targeting individuals is flawed in its very conceptualisation. Taking this individual approach reinforces the messages that these big systemic problems are merely a matter of individual responsibility. And of course, it can be really useful politically to do this. Making problems individual absolves government of any role in solving them or acting on the system changes that are needed. And it's worse than that because it doesn't just absolve government from action, it serves to further stigmatise already stigmatised and burdened populations. In New Zealand just last month, a political leader made the statement that obesity was an individual problem. She said people should not blame systems for personal choices, and solving obesity was down to personal responsibility, not government. In response, this brave man posted an incredibly powerful message on Facebook speaking about his own struggle with obesity and taking personal responsibility for that, but in the simplest way possible, also explaining to this politician who should have known better that there's a system in place that supports obesity, and not only that, but a system that has existed through generations. And without changing that system, the problem will never be solved. So marketing and communication programs that target the individual allow politicians to feel they're addressing the problem when all they're really doing is shifting the blame and layering guilt onto already burdened populations. As I noted, many people we want to reach with our programs are likely to be experiencing multiple stresses. They might be living in crowded housing or moving house frequently. They might also be experiencing substance abuse or experiencing mental or physical ill health, or living with violence, and or suffering loss or grief, and or feeling hopeless about job loss or inability to connect with work or learning. Such unacceptable levels of stress experienced over prolonged periods, these levels of stress are described as toxic for the chemical effects that they have on our bodies and brains. Research from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child shows that this chemical effect impairs our decision-making capability and reduces our executive function. That means that decision-making capability and the ability to respond to new information is reduced. This means that interventions that are designed with the best will in the world to inform people of harm or inform them of opportunities to avoid harm, or by asking them to change their behaviour, these interventions may in fact be adding to stress that is already at toxic levels. We may be doing more harm than good. Another implication of targeting interventions to overwhelmed populations is the risk of increasing the sense of social norm around risk behaviours within those populations. Even if we're really careful with our imagery, and even with, as in the example pictured, we're creating powerful and award-winning creative executions, we have to ask ourselves, what is the cumulative effect of these depictions? For the population we're targeting and the individuals within it, what is the story we are telling? As a minimum, we risk with such depictions creating a belief that it's normal or expected in my community, in the case pictured, to be exposed to drugs, that drug taking is normal in my community, it's okay, for me even, it's accepted or expected. But even first, we risk further stigmatising those vulnerable populations and creating a sense of isolation, deepening community stereotypes, entrenching self-stigma, and removing the possibility of help or change. So what does this mean for government communicators? Well, first, we have to stop acting as though the problem we are setting out to solve is the only problem the communities and the people within them are facing, or that we are the only government agency trying to reach people on these important life issues. In the picture here, I've just given the example of the low socioeconomic parent who might be targeted by government for multiple programs at once, with the cumulative effect that we're asking already stressed people to effectively be perfect citizens. Think about toxic stress and what reaction it's likely to trigger in this sort of context. To change this, we have to completely rethink how government works, and rather than treating issues as isolated and individual, take a system view, collaborating across government on the solution. If the problems themselves don't arise from a single source, so the solutions should not arise from a single source either. This is what the UK think tank Demos has called the public sector's moral obligation to collaborate. That quote comes from quite an old Demos paper, I think 2007 or 2008, and collaboration has been an unresolved question for the government sector for decades. It's an area where intention and action have been slow to connect, as the time needed to collaborate generally works against the sometimes urgent and, perhaps artificial deadlines for many programs. But it's time we got serious about this. And crucially, we have to stop imagining that we can be the creators of the solution. In fact, even more than not imagining we're the creators of the solution, we have to stop imagining that we know what the problem is. To quote the Southern Initiative, which is setting out to transform South Auckland, only the hood can change the hood. This means we have to trust communities to be the owners of their own solutions. our role changes from leader to enabler. Communities can tell us what their priority problems are if we just listen to them. They have the power to work together if we give them that power to identify solutions that are going to be much more meaningful than government can achieve on its own. A few years ago, a survey in a marginalised New Zealand community identified that the most pressing problem for families there was safety, personal safety. I would argue that in that community, no program designed to improve diet or smoking or parenting was ever going to work until that fundamental, almost Maslowian problem of safety was addressed. And if that was the community's identified problem, it should therefore have become the government's priority in that community before anything else took over. I mentioned South Auckland before. The Southern Initiative has an excellent program exploring what the system is that affects parents in that area, what sorts of supports might be needed to improve outcomes for babies and children. A massive issue that was identified through the work that they did was crowded housing and the need for more and better public amenities, well, better housing, but in addition to that, more and better public amenities so that families could create home outside of the home. This new problem and solution weren't apparent at first, but good things are happening now that those ideas have been identified. The starting point in that region is not some sort of education about the needs of the child or what good parenting looks like. Actually, most of them know that. They just have these other barriers that make it impossible for them to even begin to address it. And yet those information and education programs and campaigns are often where we think to start. Way back in 2011 at a World Social Marketing Conference, Martine Stead from the University of Stirling challenged participants about the extent to which they were genuinely engaging with communities. And this is the continuum she put up for us, where at one end, community engagement was really just actually using people as respondents to research. And at the other end, it was where communities were leading the intervention. The little vertical arrow there is showing where, by her assessment, most social marketing communication campaigns out of government were operating down at this least engaged end of the spectrum. And obviously her exhortation to us was to change that. Unfortunately, over the years since she presented this model, I don't think it's changed that much at all. And it's pretty understandable why not, because engaging with communities is tough. You have to share, you have to be prepared to be challenged, you have to change your plan, you have to worry a bit less about things being perfect or measurable, you have to be prepared to take risk. Then there's the problem that communities don't often want to be engaged, or at least not by you. They don't know how to engage, they don't have the resources to engage, they don't have the capability or the time or the inclination to stay engaged. It costs more, it takes time, it's riskier, you lose control. But all those reasons why we don't do it are overwhelmed by the reason why we need to do it. We have to start if we want to ensure our programs reduce rather than increase inequalities. So my presentation was intended as a provocation, not a how-to. And I think actually most people know how. But I will put forward a couple of practical tips nonetheless. First, involve people early before you've identified a problem to solve, before you've even started to hypothesize what a solution might be. Second, listen continuously and return to the conversation repeatedly. I think about this, talk about this as 1,000 cups of tea. You have to be prepared to keep going back, show that you mean it. Organise on the government side to reduce the burden of engagement on the community side. Provide practical support for people's involvement. If we're asking communities to be involved in this, actually we have to pay them, or we have to provide childcare, or we have to go to them, or we have to create spaces for it to happen, or all of those things. Be open to unexpected solutions. I said earlier, sometimes the solution is to a different problem altogether, but it will get you where you need to go. And test and monitor and learn and adapt, of course, for everything we do. These things are hard. I keep saying that. The system of government, in a way, sort of mitigates against this kind of approach. And so my next challenge to you comes at a personal level. At the risk of contributing to your levels of toxic stress, here is my challenge to you. If you want to generate programs that truly create a power shift, the first and absolutely most important factor is to set the intention to engage. Make this concept the heart of your approach and the driving factor for your decision making. And come back to it again and again as you work through your program, and as you come across barriers, remind yourself, we have this intention, we need to stick to it. And all of that means, of course, that you need to lead. And wherever you are in the organisation, and however junior or senior you are, you can lead, and you will need to challenge to make that happen. It means being prepared to fight for your approach in the way that's appropriate and effective within your organisation. And thirdly, slow the game down. Timeframes for government problems are almost always way too short. And we have to change that if we're going to genuinely engage and we're genuinely collaborate, and therefore genuinely contribute to reducing inequalities. So understand that you need to invest time to realise the dividends of effectiveness, and use your leadership to continuously make that time and space available for your program. So it's like taking a big leap. It's like jumping out of a plane. And sometimes when you're in the middle of doing it, you can't quite see the shape that's forming. But this year, the response to COVID has shown us what is actually possible. And in New Zealand in particular, the New Zealand government's multidisciplinary communications team has shown us that we're capable of many things we never thought were possible before. In New Zealand, COVID-19 communications showed us that system responses are possible, and that collaboration across government can work under the most extraordinarily difficult and challenging of circumstances. COVID-19 has shown us that determined leadership can actually achieve pretty much anything. On the flip side, the other thing about COVID is that post-COVID, societal and economic inequalities are increasing. So we have never had a greater need than ever before for programs that change things and create that power shift to reduce inequalities rather than contribute to deepening them. So what an opportunity we have now to find the time and the space to deeply and genuinely engage with our communities, and to ensure our approaches are designed in ways that enable those communities to participate in engagement. The benefits of these approaches are going to be manifold. In a future of greater collaboration, we may see fewer social marketing programs initiating from government, but at the same time more that address the root causes of harm. And we may see greater shared ownership of problems and solutions. Marketing and communications are such powerful tools that government can use to generate real and positive change. But right now, when so much has changed and we're rethinking what the future might look like, we have the opportunity to really also rethink how we do what we do. So it's time to take the leap. Thank you.